It's good to be back. Yeah. So good afternoon. My name is Nick Dyer-Witherford. I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at the University of Western Ontario, and it is my great privilege to introduce this afternoon's speaker. I and my wife, Anne, have known Douglas Gibson and his wife, Jane, now his stage manager and tech roadie, for many years. We have had frequent opportunity to enjoy Doug's company, his hospitality, his knowledge, and his wit. And I now have the additional pleasure of saying a few words about him. I'll cut straight to the chase. Doug is a hero of Can Lit. Others better qualified than I have expressed the same sentiment more eloquently. For example, the famous novelist Alice Munro declared, "No one has done more for Canadian literature than this man, Douglas Gibson." Doug came to Canada from Scotland in 1967, one of his first residence stops, I understand, being here in London. He worked as editor for Macmillan Canada, and then in 1986 joined the great, at the time, Canadian publisher McClellan and Stewart, of which he eventually became president. In those roles, he has been editor and often friend of authors of English Canadian fiction, including Mavis Gallant, Alice Munro, Robertson Davies, Hugh MacLennan, Guy van der Hague, and W.O. Mitchell, and many others. He has also edited the works of non-fiction authors, including the memoirs of Canadian prime ministers. Doug has labored to ensure that the works of Canadian writers make the fraught transit from the mind to the readable page and the saleable book. His services to this country's culture were recognized this year when he was awarded the Order of Canada. Doug is, however, not only an editor, but since his retirement from publishing in 2008, an author in his own right. Many of you will have read his two sparkling volumes of literary memoir, Stories About Storytellers and Across Canada by Story, books which, as a born raconteur, he has subsequently turned into stage shows. Doug is therefore both the indispensable helper of storytellers and himself a magnificent storyteller. No one could therefore be better qualified to speak on his topic this afternoon, 150 years of great Canadian storytellers, 1867 to 2017. I give you Douglas Gibson.
Well, thank you, Nick. It's downhill from here on. That's the high point. But let me step away from this mic and bellow, because I want you to see what I'm wearing. This is my publisher's uniform. This is what I wore when I was having snuff sneezed all over me by W.O. Mitchell. This is what I was wearing when Pierre Trudeau almost killed me. I worked with Pierre in his memoirs, and we became friends. And after that, whenever I went to Montreal, where he was retired, working as a lawyer, I'd say, "Can I drop by, say hello?" And he said, "Sure." The celebrity lawyers are not always very busy. So he'd say, "Sure," and I'd go. And on this occasion, and I just come away from a couple of back operations, so I wasn't at my most nimble. But Pierre said, "Oh, are you free for lunch?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So we got out of his office and went to Rennie-Levesque Boulevard, which is 6 lanes. And to my horror, because I was walking carefully, I went towards the corner and he said, "No, no, no." And he went straight across the 6 lanes, and he's in his late 70s at this point. And I think, oh my God. It went fine until we hit the median, and then the lights changed, and he turned to me and he saw 3 lanes and 1 yellow car coming turned to me and said, "Run." I thought that was going to be the last word I ever heard. And I was going to end up on a Trivial Pursuit card. What is the name of the man killed alongside Pierre Trudeau? But my publisher's uniform protected me, and I made it. And here I am. And here I am, delighted to be at Words. I was here a couple of years ago. I've met some friends who remember me from that. And it is a superb festival. I'm just thrilled to be here again. And I urge you now to fasten your seatbelts, because we're going to do something really dangerous. We're going to cover 150 years, decade by decade, of Canada's greatest storytellers in English and in French. So think about that. So hold on to your hats. And we're going to do it with the help of the wonderful Anthony Jenkins, the illustrator who produced these caricatures. And decade by decade, we're going to work up to his demonstration of the author in question, and then I'll speak about the author. But before that, in each decade, we begin with a burst of music and showing a number of iconic Canadian works of art to give you the background, and then boom, straight into the author. Now, we're going to start with something a little different, because storytelling didn't begin for the very first time on July 1st, 1867. There were Indigenous storytellers all across Canada for thousands of years, and that's where we start. When my Vancouver friend, Robert Bringhurst, was encouraged to explore the Haida language by the sculptor Bill Reid, he was surprised by what he found. He discovered that although today there are fewer than 50 fluent Haida speakers still alive, in the old days, among the people in Haida Gwaii and the remote Pacific Islands within sight of Alaska, storytelling was such an important part of the culture that there were full-time professional storytellers. To his astonishment, he found that one of thousands of Indigenous storytellers, was named Sky. And miraculously, Sky's stories had been preserved on yellowed paper by an anthropologist named Swanton. And they showed that Canada had a magnificent early storyteller like Homer, our Homer. Sky, a former warrior with a crippled back, shown here imaginatively by Anthony Jenkins, was at the height of his powers around 1867. We can learn about him in Robert Bringhurst's important 1999 book, A Story as Sharp as a Knife. But you should know that Robert is not only a fine linguist who once made his living translating from Arabic, he's also an excellent poet. So he translated Sky's Haida poems into vivid English. Here's an example. One of Sky's stories concerns a warrior leader named Gitkuna. Sky tells us that Gitkuna angered the gods of the sea and was advised to stay on shore. But one day, a silver sea otter swam into the harbor, and in his canoe, Gitkuna had to have it. Oh! Gitkuna took a crew of 3 men and they chased it. First, he tried to shoot it in the harbor. Then it led him out to sea. The mist closed in on him at once then. And then they beat the drums for him at Kuna and pounded on the beach logs. After 2 days and nights of steady fog, dawn broke calm and clear. Some went out to search, the direction of Lake Inlet. Others went to search for him towards Rock Point. His paddle was the only thing they found. Philippe Joseph Aubert de Gaspé. De Gaspé was a seigneur, one of the traditional gentry who ran things in Quebec. In fact, he was at one point the magistrate who ran the old jail in Quebec City. You can still visit that jail at the Morin Centre, which is shown here, in the heart of old Scottish Quebec, on the Chaussée des Écossais, right beside the old St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church and its Kirk Hall. Above the restored cells of the old jail, you can also visit the historic library, home of the ancient Literary and Historical Society of Quebec. Speakers who have appeared there include not only me, but some years earlier, in 1844, a guy named Charles Dickens. Now, Dickens knew all about debtors' prisons because his family was split up when he was 13 and his father went to debtors' prison in England. Incredibly, when our man, de Gaspé, fell into debt, he ended up in jail, his own jail. He spent 4 years in a cell where he could look out and see his own house across the street. Think about that. And when eventually he got out, he resumed his life. And then when he was 77 years of age, he brought out the first great Canadian novel in French, Les Anciens Canadiens. The model here is not Charles Dickens, but the historical novelist Sir Walter Scott. In this book about two young friends from high school in Quebec City who are destined to meet on opposite sides on the plains of Abraham, the Scottish hero is, as opposed to his Quebecois friend Jules d'Aberville, is named Archibald Cameron de Lochiel. The book, first published in 1863, was a classic and was eagerly read for many years in both languages. It's a fine book involving history, traditional Quebec life and folklore, ghost stories, and even the old party games that the seigneurs played after dinner. It includes very exciting scenes like one when an injured man is rescued by the gallant Lochiel from an ice floe on the St. Lawrence when the ice goes out. Even the footnotes are fascinating. When we see historiquement, historical fact, we're likely to learn that this unlikely event actually happened to the novelist's grandmother. So this first great Quebec novel provides fine reading today. It set the tradition of Quebec fascination with the Ancien Régime and the Conquest, and was very widely read in 1867. William Kirby. Niagara-on-the-Lake was once the capital of Upper Canada. And if you go down to the lakefront where across the river you can see the American fort, and then you turn left, you'll soon come to a trim white colonial house from 1819. A plaque outside will tell you it belonged to William Kirby, who there wrote Canada's great Gothic novel, The Golden Dog. Born in England, Kirby was brought to Ohio in 1832, then came to Canada in 1839. He settled in Niagara-on-the-Lake as a tanner and was soon tanning the skins of political opponents who didn't share his United Empire loyalist Tory principles. He became the fiery editor of the local paper and was involved in politics, sometimes writing under the nom de plume Britannicus. He also wrote one of the best historical novels. And like Philippe Aubert de Gaspé, Kirby chose the conquest of Quebec as the theme of his novel. And significantly for him, the people of Quebec are his heroes. This Gothic novel is mostly set in 1748, when in Quebec City young gallants fight sword duels to the death over beautiful maidens who are likely to enter the convent when their hearts are broken. You'll find beautiful women, high romance, gallant soldiers, and an evil poisoner, La Corriveau, who has inherited a variety of fatal poisons from the Borgias. The Gothic climax is a midnight death in a lonely tower where the unsuspecting beautiful victim, suddenly throwing back her head with dark eyes fixed on vacancy and holding the fatal bouquet fast in her hands, fell stone dead at the feet of La Corriveau. They don't write paragraphs like that anymore. The Golden Dog ends very powerfully with a 1797 scene in the Quebec City fortress. In Kirby's words, the noblest names and lineage of New France had come forward as loyal subjects of England's crown to defend Canada against evil Benedict Arnold's invading Americans. The noblest names include the de Gaspés. The good guys win, of course. Roll Britannicus. You're going to hear a lot about the huge role that women have played among our great fiction writers. But here's our first great female Canadienne novelist, Félicité Angers, who wrote under the nom de plume Laure Conan. She was born and raised in La Bay, formerly Murray Bay, down the St. Lawrence from Quebec City. But it was to Quebec City that she went as a gentleman's daughter to study at the Ursuline Convent School, right beside the historic Ursuline Church where Montcalm's tomb lies. In Quebec, she fell in love with a young MP, and that unrequited love affair blighted her life. But in 1884, she produced our first great psychological novel, Angeline de Montbrun. We're in Jane Austen territory here, although very few of Jane's country house visits involve strolls to see the nearby place in Gaspé where Cartier landed and erected the famous cross. Even fewer Jane Austen novels involve romantic young women sighing over brave ancestors who met their deaths at the end of a tomahawk. But after many Austen-like gossipy letters between the central characters, suddenly we learn that Angeline's saintly father has died in a hunting accident. Her life falls apart, and most of the rest of the book is devoted to her heartbroken diary. In what some have called her unhealthy worship of her father, she rejects her fiancé for the pursuit of good works approved by the church. Now, this is a striking example of the reach of the roman du terroir, the novel of the land, that was so important to Quebec culture. Here, the heroic father, Monsieur de Montbrun, is so devoted to the land that he works on the harvest with gloves shielding his aristocratic hands, even on his wedding day. But as Canada's first great psychological novel, this book raised so many questions that in the 1900s, there was a popular play in Montreal involving on-stage conversations between Gabriel Roy, Annie Hébert, Germaine Guevremont, and our author, the trailblazing Félicité Angers. Sarah Jeanette Duncan. If you don't know this amazing woman, you should. She was born and raised in Brantford, Ontario, and she seemed all set to become a teacher, but decided that journalism would be more fun. Soon, in 1886, she became the first woman ever employed full-time by the Toronto Globe. Using the protective male pseudonym of Garth Grafton, she later worked for the Montreal Star as its parliamentary correspondent in Ottawa, becoming the very first woman member of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. But other adventures beckoned her. She, in 1888, set off around the world with a friend, first by train to Vancouver, then by steamer to Japan, Sri Lanka, India, Egypt, and England. The result was a very successful novel called A Social Departure. Another result was that in India, she met a museum official who was bowled over by this female whirlwind and proposed to her at the Taj Mahal. She went back to India, married him in 1890, and lived there for 25 years. During that time, she wrote many novels, some about North Americans in Europe, which brought her in touch with Henry James, and many about colonial India, which allowed her to entertain E.M. Forster on his passage to India. But it was her Canadian novel, The Imperialist, that gains her a place here. It's a terrific book, set in Brantford. It's a political novel where the young lawyer hero is keen to strengthen the ties between Canada and Imperial Britain, a movement that was in fact popular around the turn of the century. But what's amusing here is that in Canada, our anti-American hero gets most of his news from American papers, and when he's in London, he can barely understand what the Cockneys are saying, and everyone assumes whenever he opens his mouth that he must be an American. Final detail, and I do urge you to read this book. It's terrific from first to last. The narrator says at one point, "We are here at the making of a nation. Great themes are in play." But Sarah Jeanette Duncan, like Alice Munro, realizes that little domestic details also count. She points out that in Elgin, the social trendsetters are changing from having the big meal in the middle of the day. They change to a big meal called dinner or supper in the evening, makes for problems with the servants that every respectable family had in those days, with the servants resenting having to work later. Who knew? Sarah Jeanette Duncan knew, and thanks to her, we all know too. Anne of Green Gables, never change. This is undoubtedly Canada's favourite novel, and I'm one of the dozens of publishers who've helped to sell millions of copies of this sunny book. Lucy Maud Montgomery was born and raised in Prince Edward Island, and although she tried her hand at a number of things, like teaching, she really wanted to be a writer. So even though she scuffled along doing really low-level editing and journalism jobs, she kept a writer's notebook for bright ideas that might be useful sometime. One day, when she was trying to come up with a theme for a serial she had to write for a Sunday school magazine, she found in the notebook an idea she'd had some years before. Elderly couple apply to an orphan asylum for a boy. By mistake, a girl is sent them. I thought this would do. There you have it. The basic plot of Anne of Green Gables, which has sold millions of copies over the years and brought half of Japan over to visit PEI. Not that getting it published was easy. Five idiot publishers turned it down before the sixth took it on. Lucy Maud not only created the PEI tourism industry, in all of her many books she gave girls the idea that ambition and humor and skill and persistence can change your life. And with one of her later books, Emily of New Moon, she changed many lives by encouraging Alice Munro to become a writer. And here we have Charles Gordon, who wrote as Ralph Connor. And in real life, Charles Gordon was a Winnipeg Presbyterian minister. As Ralph Connor, he was Canada's most successful novelist around the world in the first 30 years of the 20th century. His first 3 books sold over 5 million copies. Just listen to the full titles and you see how he drew on the excitement of pioneer Canada's expanding frontiers with books like Black Rock, A Tale of the Selkirks, then The Sky Pilot, A Tale of the Foothills, and then The Man from Glengarry, A Tale of the Ottawa. Over 5 million copies. His exciting tales of the frontier allowed him to bring in ranchers, cowboys, miners, loggers, and shantymen, colourful fist-fighting characters who were usually roped in by a civilizing agent, often an admirable young minister, a sky pilot. The Man from Glengarry takes us from the logging shanties in Ontario to the acres of great logging rafts in the river at Quebec that we've already seen in the Krieghoff painting, all the way to Ronald MacDonald's exciting times creating the logging industry in distant BC. He leads a delegation to Ottawa, where he gets Sir John A., a fellow clansman, to promise a national railroad keeping British Columbia in Canada. He put his royalties money into a huge house in Winnipeg at 54 Westgate, the Ralph Connor Mansion, which you can still visit, as I've done, and into a family cottage near Kenora, on an island in the Lake of the Woods. You may know that cottage. How so? Because the Reverend Charles Gordon had a grandson my age named Charles Gordon, who wrote for me the great classic funny book about Canadian summer life entitled At the Cottage. If you guess that the author of this loving portrait of traditional life on a Quebec farm must have been born to that life, you couldn't be more wrong. Louis Aymon was born in France, in Brittany. He went as a boy to Paris, where in due course this Breton outsider got a law degree, did military service, and then in 1903 he swung his predictable life around completely. He moved to England and became a sports writer for a French magazine. Then, in 1911, he abandoned his wife and daughter in England and sailed for Canada. After brief spells in Quebec City and in Montreal, where he was a stenographer in an insurance company, of all things, he went back to the land. He moved to Perabonka up in the Lac Saint-Jean country, and he lived and worked on the Bedard family farm as a sweating, dawn-to-dusk labourer. And the result of this experience was Maria Chapdelaine, one of Canada's most influential novels. The book was a worldwide bestseller. It inspired the illustrations by Clarence Gagnon that you've already seen, and it made the name of Louis Aymon very famous. The plot revolves around young Maria Chapdelaine and her harsh life on a remote pioneer farm. It's so remote that when her fiancé, François Paradis, sets off in December to hike for some days through the snowy bush to visit her and becomes écarté, gets lost, everyone knows that his body will never be found, ever. And Maria then is courted by 2 other young men and must make a choice between an easy, rich, urban life in the United States or staying to work the land. Now, while some readers see Maria Chapdelaine as a hymn of praise for the simple life, others see it as a warning against being trapped as penniless peasants. Certainly, the author was no help in solving that argument. He sent the manuscript off to France to be published as a serial early in 1914, only coming out as a book in Canada in 1960. But by then, Imon was dead. In 1913, he left Quebec and was heading out west when in Chapleau, Ontario, which we heard about this afternoon from Liz Howard, in Chapleau, he jumped out in front of a train. Stephen Leacock. Robertson Davies once told me that Stephen Leacock could have been a very fine, serious novelist. Certainly he led a very full, serious life. He and his brothers had to kick his abusive father out of the house on the farm near Sutton, Ontario. Stephen may have gone to fancy Upper Canada College, but lack of money forced him to drop out of university and to spend 10 years teaching high school, which he hated, to get the education that allowed him to become a professor at McGill. Even there, fate knocked him around. He lost his wife to cancer at 45. Their only son, little Stevie, remained miniature, so tiny that he barely reached 5 feet and became an embittered drunk. And Leacock loved his role as a chuckling professor in a torn old gown so much that he hated it when he was forced to retire at 65. He was the most successful funny writer in the world. Just think about some of his greatest jokes, from Gertrude the governess, when the noble Lord Ronald has a dispute with his father, Lord Nosh, who threatens to disinherit him. Lord Ronald said nothing. He flung himself from the room, flung himself upon his horse, and rode madly off in all directions. And in Hannah of the Highlands, there's his great comment on Scottish pride, where Hannah returns to her father, Oyster McOyster, to show him a sixpence that she has received from a member of the McQuinnes clan. And Oyster McOyster grabs the sixpence and says, "Siller from a McQuinnes," and he takes the sixpence and hurls it down onto the roadway, and then picks it up and dashes it against the wall of his cottage, and then finally he picks it up and contemptuously dashes it into the pocket of his kilt. Some of us know his piece, My Financial Career, almost off by heart. You know, the one that begins, "When I go into a bank, I get rattled." And everyone knows his hilarious sunshine sketches of a little town, including the dramatic sinking of the Mariposa Belle in 5 feet of water, where the gallant rescuers in the lifeboat coming from town are all safely hauled aboard, all saved. The town in question is Orillia, and you can visit the old Leacock house on Old Brewery Bay, a fine name, that he built with his royalties from around the world. The old cottage is preserved so carefully that there, among the dishes, straw hats, and tennis rackets ready for service, it's hard to avoid the Goldilocks feeling that the owners will return at any moment. And every year his name lives on when the best Canadian book of humour, often by Terry Follis, is given the Stephen Leacock Award. Maurice Constantin Ware, born in Lorraine in France, the son of a cavalry officer, he came to Manitoba in 1904, where he raised cattle and tried his hand at many things. Soon he was writing about himself as a cowboy, inaccurately, and marrying a Métis woman. When war broke out, he abandoned her and went back to France. After the war, he became a very prolific writer with 50 books to his name. But he became best known for his Manitoba novels, where he took great liberties with the stories of early fur traders and tales about Louis Riel. In 1928, he brought out his great novel, Un homme se penche sur son passé, The Man Reflects on His Past. Its account of the heroic French narrator fighting prairie winters greatly impressed European readers, and it won France's grand literary prize, Le Prix Goncourt. For us in Canada, however, the adventures of this French storyteller are literally unbelievable. Early on, for example, as a cowboy and horse trader, he invokes Buffalo Bill as a comparison, where his matey companion stampedes the horses with pistol shots across the open prairie. They come on a colony of doukhobors where they see young men with whips forcing the women to toil in the fields. Later, in winter, he heads north as a trapper, experiencing horrors you wouldn't believe. He goes snowblind. He starves until he boils and eats a pair of moccasins. His French companion freezes his lungs and dies on the trail. To keep the encircling wolves away from the corpse, he coats it in ice. He shoots a wolf and is saved by gulping down its warm blood. All this and exciting tales to cities like Moose Jaw and Winnipeg, where a high point is a visit to Eaton's Emporium on Portage Avenue. Amazing excitement. 2 lessons here. First, 1928 was clearly not a year of tough competition for Le Prix Goncourt, which had been won just 9 years earlier by Marcel Proust. Second, this book's main achievement is that it took French Canadian literature out of Quebec and into the West. Morley Callaghan. Morley Callaghan was the great novelist of the 10 last years of the Depression. He was a Toronto boy who went on to law school but never practiced. His summer job at the Toronto Star brought him in touch with a journalist there named Hemingway, who liked the short stories he was writing on the side and encouraged him to become a writer. With Hemingway's help, he did become a professional writer, somehow making a living and raising a family on his writing. Although, of course, the friendship was strained in Paris in 1929 when the macho Hemingway challenged the smaller Toronto guy to box with him, and Morley knocked him down. I knew Morley well and edited 5 of his later novels, but critics agree that his greatest work came in the 30s, especially with the 1937 bestseller, More Joy in Heaven. The background to that book is fascinating, especially if you know of Morley's interest in outsiders. In 1935, a famous Canadian bank robber named Red Ryan was paroled from his life sentence after people like Prime Minister Bennett were impressed by his model behavior in prison and his obvious rehabilitation. 10 months after he was paroled, he died in a hail of bullets while robbing a liquor store in Sarnia. The public outrage stirred Morley, who within 2 years wrote this novel about Kip Cayley, a model prisoner who worked to help others in jail. When he is paroled, Kip is supported by scores of well-wishers, from the rich Senator McLean to the city mayor. He's a big, impressive, good-looking guy, and Kip is hired as a greeter at the local hotel and nightclub. But soon he comes to realize that he's being used by his so-called friends and will not get the truly useful role on the parole board that he really wants. The plot builds up towards a horrific shootout. A policeman lining up to donate blood so that Kip can be kept alive in order to be hanged. Philippe Pinton, Ringuet. This man's great book, Trente Arpents, is the ultimate version of Quebec's Roman du Terroir, the novel of the land. It's the story of a man born to the farming land that runs from the St. Lawrence north to the Laurentian Hills. For 50 years, he trudges along the same furrows as his ancestors from Normandy, behind the plough horses, his ancestors also followed. Alcariste Moisan is not just attached to his land and its seasonal tasks, he is chained to it. From 1880 to the 1930s, we follow his life as a man who puts everything every day into his land. It's good land, and he becomes a rich, successful farmer. Then his life changes. He's slow to adapt to newfangled things like tractors that can't eat grass or hay. He gets into an expensive lawsuit with a neighbor. When prices rise, he greedily keeps his crops in the barn, waiting for even higher prices until the barn burns down with no insurance. The downward spiral continues until the local notary scrams out of the country, taking all of his clients' money with him. When Eucharist hands the farm to one of his sons, he's betrayed. He ends up sheltering with another son in New England, working as a night watchman and living with little grandsons who can't speak a word of French and call him that man. It's a powerful book, which I heartily recommend. I read it as I read all of the French books I talk about in the original French. In my case, slow, but instructive. One of the things I learned is that while the novel is written in sophisticated modern French, when the speaker is one of the farmers, they speak the rough local idiom. So we is spelled way, moi is moe, and the hay-eating animal is not a cheval, but a joual. So here you have the popular language, commonly called joual, formally appearing in a major, very successful book. As for the author, Philippe Pinton amazingly was a doctor and a professor of medicine who wrote fiction as a hobby. After being hailed as Quebec's great novelist and compared to Zola and Tolstoy, he made another great career change when in 1956 he became Canada's ambassador to Portugal. But his writing hobby was his greatest achievement. Gabrielle Roy. When Gabrielle Roy brought out her first novel, Bonheur d'Occasion, in 1945, the world of Canadian writing changed forever. Here was a long novel that was in French and set in Quebec. It had nothing to do with the countryside or farming or Quebec history and traditions. Instead, it was set in the heart of downtown Montreal, in the midst of the downtrodden slum of Saint-Henri. Shaken by the trains that rumble through and polluted by the factories all around, this is a hopeless slum, battered by the Great Depression. Bonheur d'Occasion really means second-hand happiness, but it became known in English as The Tin Flute. And it is superb, one of the greatest Canadian novels. It tells the story of the Lacasse family in 1940, near the start of the war. The father, Azarius, is an impractical dreamer who has been unemployed for many months. The heroic mother, Rosanna, scrimps and saves to put food on the table for the 8 kids. Things are so bad that they have to move every year to smaller and meaner lodgings. So bad that the son Eugène joins the army to see that his mother gets 20 belles piastres par mois, maman, or $20 a month. We get to know all of the family, although Gabrielle was said once that she was surprised by how the mother, Rosanna, took over the story. A central theme is what the eldest daughter, Florentine, bringing in money as a waitress, decides to do when she gets pregnant. The Tin Flute was chosen as the book of the month in New York with 700,000 copies printed, and it won the English language Governor General's Award in Canada in 1947. Gabrielle Waugh went on to write many other books and to become the first woman elected to the Canadian Royal Society. She lived happily in Quebec, respected by readers in both languages, until a bolt from the blue from her youth in St. Boniface, Manitoba, caused her death. A jealous sister, at the age of 85, brought out a bitter book that caused Gabrielle to have a serious heart attack that eventually killed her 3 years later. The Ugly Sister lived on to be 105 years old. Hugh MacLennan. In 1967, when the very first Order of Canada awards were presented, 2 authors were honoured as companions of the order, Gabrielle Waugh and Hugh MacLennan. I knew Hugh MacLennan well as his editor, his publisher, and his friend. I spoke at his funeral in the McGill Chapel in 1990. He was a great man, and for many decades was a huge influence on Canadian life. He not only won 3 Governor General's Awards for his fiction, but 2 for his non-fiction essays, which often deal with Canada's politics, geography, and history. He was a friend of Pierre Trudeau, who came quietly, I remember, to Hugh's 80th birthday celebrations. Hugh was still writing important new work in the late 1980s, although his first novel, Barometer Rising, about the Halifax explosion, came out as early as 1942. His greatest novel is The Watch That Ends the Night, published in 1959, where Jerome Martel, long thought dead in the war, reappears in Montreal to complicate the lives of his former wife, Catherine, and George Stewart, the narrator, who has married her. But I've selected him for this decade in the 40s because it was in 1945 that he produced Two Solitudes, the book that gave all of us a new term to describe Canada. It begins with a famous description of the St. Lawrence as it flows past Montreal and moves northeastward 1,000 miles to the sea. And thus Hugh MacLennan, the boy from Nova Scotia who won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, then a doctorate from Princeton, sets out to describe the struggles of the traditional Quebec landowner Athanase Tallard, his Irish wife Kathleen, and their son Paul, as they work out their lives in this very complicated country. Two solitudes indeed. Roger Lemlin. In real life, he might have been a Gabrielle Waugh character. He was the eldest of 10 kids, growing up poor in the lower town in Quebec City. He had to leave school at 14 to start work, yet somehow he broke through all of the class barriers by continuing to read and study on his own, and at the age of 25, against all the odds, he produced his first novel about the working class world he knew. His great success came with Les Ploufs in 1948. This family saga was a lively, often satirical look at Quebec society run by mothers and stodgy priests, yet slowly moving towards modernity. It became hugely popular, and Les Ploufs became a long-running TV series. In much of Canada, people got their first TV sets to watch the coronation in London. In Quebec, many got them in order to watch Les Ploufs. I was astounded by what a good book Les Ploufs is. A lot of it is devoted to the daily life of this very eccentric family and the good jokes that spring from it. For instance, there's Ovid, the highfalutin opera lover, who's trying to impress a girl and puts on an opera show at home for family and friends. When he emerges onto the makeshift stage as an opera star, grandly wrapped in a colourful robe, his mother exclaims, "Mon tapis de table, that's my tablecloth." But Les Plouffe also deals with huge issues like the controversial decision of the church in Quebec to support the unpopular war in 1940. And the last line in the book speaks to Roger Lemland's humanity. When Ovid reads aloud a letter home from his young brother Guillaume, who's been fighting with the Canadian Army in Holland, and you saw the Alex Colville painting of exactly that, his frank account causes his old mother to break out in horror. "C'est pas croyable. Guillaume qui tue des hommes?" It's unbelievable. Our Guillaume has been killing people. That's the very last line in the book. Canada joins Newfoundland. W.O. Mitchell. For millions of Canadians, the initials were enough to identify him, not to mention the wild white hair and the snuff-stained mustache and the crackling prairie voice, doing more than its share of goddamn swearing as he roamed the country, giving speeches or readings or outrageous performances. This was the larger-than-life writer who in 1947 gave us the first great prairie novel, Who Has Seen the Wind? The book is set in his hometown of Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and we watch his main character, young Brian, learn about life and people on the edge of the prairie, which is a constant major presence, as we can see in these illustrations from the book by William Kerrilake. And when 10-year-old Brian's dad dies, the old Scottish granny limps upstairs to pull out the family Bible, given, as you can see, to an ancestor in Dunlop, Scotland. Now, I know that Dunlop in Ayrshire, that's where I came from, is a tiny place with fewer than 1,000 people, because my family has been from Dunlop for several generations. And it refers to a Mitchell family link too. Inspired by that link, I worked with W.O. as his editor on 10 of his books and loved him and his wife Myrna very dearly. I've even visited the old home in Weyburn, and when he was a boy, like Brian, it was just a block away from the start of the prairie. But now that Weyburn has grown, the open prairie is many blocks away, but the influence is still strong. So is the influence of the radio series Jake and the Kid that entertained CBC audiences for many years, and the later books he wrote for me. But W.O., Bill Mitchell, was more than just an excellent writer who delighted people with his funny books. He was a serious artist who knew how to pull the country together. In October 1970, when Pierre Laporte was murdered, Canadians were stunned. Nobody knew what to do. But a wise CBC producer flew W.O. Mitchell from Calgary to a TV studio in Toronto. Looking right into the camera, the crackly-voiced prairie guy began with the words, "There's been a death in my family." At the end, among the hardened CBC pros, there was not a dry eye in the studio. Robertson Davies. In the 1940s, this former actor left London's Old Vic Theatre to return to Canada with an Australian wife, and to become Saturday Night Magazine's literary editor. He was soon to become the country's leading playwright, with half a dozen plays to his name. In fact, his first great literary ambition was to become our great playwright, not novelist. But in 1951, he produced his first novel, Tempest Tossed, the start of the Salterton trilogy, which was clearly set in a fictional version of his hometown, Kingston. The novelist's voice is distinctive, and obviously this was something worth pursuing in due course. But he had been busy editing the Peterborough Examiner from 1940 to 55, writing 12,000 words in an average week, not to mention his work for the Toronto Star as its literary editor. Then came his move to teach at the University of Toronto in his life-changing role as the first master of the new Massey College at the university in '63. This was a man who led many lives, and with his dramatic looks and style, he attracted attention wherever he went. You can see that he looked like God. In 1970, he published Fifth Business, and at the age of 57, his life changed. He was a novelist, a superb novelist, as the world soon recognized. The book, a sort of memoir by Dunstan Ramsay, a retired Canadian teacher, was so different from anything he'd written previously, so much richer and so much franker, that even his friends were amazed. A colleague once asked him what had changed. "People died," said Davies darkly. He was referring to his parents, whose deaths freed him to write as he pleased. I knew him well, and spoke at his televised memorial service, calling him the last Upper Canadian. I even sang there on television, giving voice to the torment that a music lover in the Cunning Man suffered when exposed to Miss Annie Magruder's inspired religious composition, "Let me call you Jesus." More seriously, I edited all but one of his novels from World of Wonders on in 1975. It was a constant education for me. It was not a surprise to Canadians when his death in '95 attracted admiring tributes from around the world. World of Wonders, indeed. Amazing Grace in Inuktitut. Yves Thériault. No Canadian author was more unlike Robertson Davies than this man, Yves Thériault. Davies was an Oxford-educated man who dressed like an Edwardian gentleman and delivered carefully crafted books polished to a high sheen. Thériault was a man whose father, a carpenter, had Montagnais Malicite roots and taught him to speak a native dialect at home in Quebec City and in Montreal, where he quit school at 15. He worked at lots of odd jobs and was in a sanatorium at Lac Saint-Jean for more than a year, but he started to write and write and write. At one point, when he was a scriptwriter for Radio Canada by day, at night he also anonymously brought out 10-cent novels so fast that he could produce 11 a week. Later, his amazing energy made him Quebec's most prolific writer. In fact, in 1986, he brought out 4 novels in the same year. 4 novels in the same year. In his life, in total, he produced over 70 books. His reputation in the wider world was made by his 1958 novel, Agaguk. It's set among the Inuit in the Labrador Ungava Bay area and introduced readers to the harsh daily life of the tundra. It's written in lively, often sexy French, but each of the 50 chapters has a title in Inuktitut. And for me, it's the best Canadian book, English or French, about traditional Inuit life on the tundra, where you survive most of the year in an igloo or igloo that you build yourself, and where each winter you must track and kill a caribou or starve to death. Agaguk, a young hunter, has hostile adventures with whites, the police, his tribe, even his own father. Twice his life is saved by his wife Iriuk, although she once has to face him down at gunpoint. High drama in the high north. Agaguk, which I recommend, was a huge international success, being translated into 20 languages. Yves Thériault was indeed, as Victor Lévy-Beaulieu wrote, un géant, a giant. In the 60s and 70s, this woman, Margaret Laurence, from Manitoba, was recognized as our greatest novelist. In fact, it became almost official when, in 1978, a conference on the Canadian novel was held at the University of Calgary. All of the professors who taught literature in our universities participated, and the book that was voted the very best Canadian novel was The Stone Angel by Margaret Laurence. She was a prairie girl, raised in the small town of Neepawa, which inspired her fictional Manawaga. The town had Scots Presbyterian respectable values of the sort that W. Mitchell's readers knew all too well. Margaret escaped them first by going to university in Winnipeg and becoming a journalist there. Then she got married and moved to Africa, where her first books were set in Somaliland and in Ghana. After the marriage ended, she moved to England, where she began to write her Manawaga novels for her publisher, Jack McClelland, back in Toronto. The Stone Angel is her most popular novel, as I mentioned, but I suggest that her greatest novel is The Diviners, written in 1974, when she had returned to live near Peterborough. It takes us outside the usual middle-class, respectable prairie circles by having the narrator, young Morag, adopted and raised by the town garbage man, Christie. It also takes us into the world of the Métis, who fought with the original Scottish settlers. But when young Morag asked Christie about whether the Métis were bad, he simmers down from his tales of heroic battles and says that no, they were just there. Later, Morag has a child with her Métis lover, Jules Tonnerre. Margaret was so much the leading writer in English in Canada that when the Writers' Union was formed in 1973, it was seen as vital that Margaret, whom I knew and published at the end of her life, be its first chair. She was a superb, hard-working leader for the writers that she called her tribe. She traveled everywhere, gallantly giving speeches to advance the cause. Only her close friends knew that she always wore a long skirt to hide the fact that her nervous knees were knocking. Jacques Ferrand. At the upper-class Brébeuf College in Montreal, the Jesuit high school where Pierre Trudeau and many other Quebec leaders went, Jacques Ferrand was such a rebel that he was expelled not once, but twice. As an adult, he was such a social rebel that he founded the Rhinoceros Party, a jokey anarchist party, teasing all political parties, but especially federal ones in Quebec. The 60s were a time of political protest in Quebec, and many of the best writers, including Ferrand, became passionate separatists. This crusading doctor, as a satirist like a modern Quebec Voltaire, wrote plays and many essays, but gained his greatest fame as a satirist poking fun at the special world of Quebec. And perhaps his most famous novel is Le Ciel de Québec, 1969. It's an extraordinary piece of playful work. Now, normally when I tell you about a novel in French, I recommend it to you. I can't do that here because this is so much an in-joke aimed at Quebecois readers. This book is so full of satire and jokes about Quebec history and its characters that my French edition runs to 480 pages. That is followed by 42 pages of notes explaining the references. And among the huge cast of Quebec characters, you'll find Paul-Émile Bourdois, the painter and pamphleteer, whose work we just saw, and Frank Scott, the poet and dean of McGill Law School, turned by Ferron mischievously into a French Quebecois. The whole book, one of 30 that he wrote during his long career, is a series of fascinating inside-the-family jokes that made Jacques Ferron a revered and trusted figure in Quebec. So trusted, in fact, that after the murder of Pierre Laporte in the 1970 October crisis, the FLQ asked the Canadian government to negotiate the departure of the suspects with one man, our man, Jacques Ferron. That same week, W.O. Mitchell, you remember, as a writer, played his part. Jacques Ferron also played a very different one. But there you have our writers at the center of our major national events. Now, we've reached a milestone, the first 100 years of our great storytellers, so it's time for a pause. We're going to have a 5-minute intermission,